You are listening to episode number 31 of the Secondary Science Simplified podcast. I have loved walking through this series with you this month on revamping your pedagogy to make it more student-centered. So far, we've covered what student-centered pedagogy is and why it is effective. So now in this episode, we will get into what you really come to this podcast for. The practical and specific details for how to do it. I'm going to walk you through 4 changes you can make today to your existing instructional resources and lesson plans to make them more student-centered. In making these changes, we are going to allow you to exit stage right so that your students can officially take center stage in their learning. Are you ready for it? Let's dive in. This is Secondary Science Simplified, a podcast for secondary science teachers who want to engage their students and simplify their lives. I'm Rebecca Joyner from It's Not Rocket Science. As a high school science teacher turned curriculum writer, I'm passionate about helping other science teachers love their jobs, serve their students, and do it all in only 40 hours a week. Are you ready to rock the time you spend in your classroom and actually have a life outside of it? You're in the right place, teacher friend. Let's get to today's episode. My very first tip, which I feel like I've already said so many times on this podcast, but maybe it hasn't been as repetitive as I think, but it is to use stations in place of lecture. I love using stations. So much so that I did an entire series of blog posts last year on them, and I'm going to link all of those in the show notes, which you can find at itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/episode 31. But in these posts, I talk about why I love stations, different ways I use them, practical tips for teaching with them, and then also some challenges that can arise when using stations and kind of some of my solutions from my own experiences to deal with those challenges. But one of my favorite ways overall that I love to use stations is in place of lecture. And I think this is a really simple way that we can decrease lecture, which is traditionally a very teacher-centered instructional method, and make our pedagogy more student-centered, make our teaching practice more about students taking ownership of their learning. And they can do that through stations that decrease lecture. When I set out to write my anatomy curriculum a few years ago, I did not want to create a curriculum full of students taking notes on body parts and then dissecting them and, labeling diagrams from the textbook. I felt like I just really wanted my students, especially these upperclassmen students who are often taking anatomy as an elective science, I wanted them to fall in love with the subject. And I wanted them to be set up to learn a lot of it for themselves. And so that's kind of when my discovery stations were born. And these discovery stations are a set of stations I made in order to teach my students about the different body systems in anatomy, all while decreasing the amount I was lecturing in the course. So when I created discovery stations for learning about these different body systems in anatomy, I made them in a way that students would be moving around the classroom. They'd be reading text, they'd be labeling diagrams, and they'd be answering comprehension questions to obtain knowledge about the organs that make up each organ system on their own. And in doing this, these stations made it possible to take my lectures and cut them by more than half. Plus, students were getting practice strengthening their reading comprehension muscles, a skill that I feel like I'm the first to admit that I don't force my students to exercise enough. And they were practicing doing things on their own and learning in an autonomous way. I will link in the show notes a blog I wrote about how to use discovery stations specifically. But in the meantime, in order to revamp your own lectures to align with this more student-centered pedagogy, here's what I encourage you to consider. It doesn't have to be just for anatomy teachers. It can be for any topic. I just use that as an example. Consider all of the courses you teach and all of the topics you teach and think, what topics do I lecture on that really aren't crazy complicated? If there's a topic that you're spending time lecturing on that students really could learn easily on their own, that's a great one to take and transfer your lecture notes into something like stations where students are going to read about it, answer questions, and learn about it on their own. Another question you can ask, what topics do I spend way too much time lecturing on? That is the question that really motivated me to make discovery stations, was I found I was going to spend way too much time lecturing on structures of the body when instead students can learn about them for themselves in stations. And then we could gather back together and talk more about how the functions work together and the big picture and all the connections of the different organ systems and that kind of thing. And then another question to consider is, what topics do you teach that just have a lot of content in them? Like they're just long. I found when I was making my biology notes that my lecture on cell theory and organelles was so long, especially for a biology 1 course where so many of the students were introduced to organelles in 7th grade life science. And while I didn't want to completely abandon going over them at some point, instead, I literally just took my slides and I printed them full page and I laminated them and they became my stations. And then students had their own papers where they went around and they read and they took notes and they labeled about them. And it was a great review for them. And then we circled back and all we really had to do in lecture was talk about the differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes, talk about how the organelles differentiated between plants and animals, and then talk more about some of those big picture connections. We didn't have to get into a review of talking about each organelle at all. We just got to then take what they had done and apply it. And that was so fun. So consider those 3 questions. What topics do you lecture on that really aren't crazy complicated? What topics do you spend way too much time lecturing on? And what topics do you just have a lot of content in that you would love to kind of decrease? Anything you listed for the answers to those questions would make great stations. You take that content, you put them in stations, and then make some sort of note outline or a set of questions to go along with it to give students, and take that to replace your lecture. Again, you can literally take existing PowerPoint slides that you already have that you use for your lecture, print them full page, 8.5 by 11, and just have that serve as your first draft of stations that you have students do. And then you've immediately taken something that might be like a 45-minute lecture traditionally that is very teacher-centered, and you've taken it and you totally dwindled it down to what's the most important thing for you to speak on from up front, and the rest students are able to learn on their own. That is such a simple way to shift your pedagogy to be more student-centered without having to do a ton of additional work. My second tip for you is to actively create a classroom environment that encourages discussions. Discussions get students talking more than they get you talking. They allow you to listen and them to tell. And like Skipper said back in the original guest episode that kind of sparked this whole series when she was talking about transitioning from one-dimensional resources and one-dimensional classrooms to three-dimensional classrooms, is that a three-dimensional classroom can really be identified by how much the students are talking versus the teacher. So that's my second tip. Let's work to create environments that make discussions natural and that make discussions just an integral part of the DNA of our classes. So let me ask you something. If an admin were to come observe your class, who would they see talking the most? You or your students? I think the answer to this question is a really important metric, and it really reveals how student-centered your pedagogy is at this point. The more you can get students talking and asking questions versus you just spewing out information, the more your class will naturally just move towards being more student-centered. And here's my favorite thing. Discussions are absolutely free. All they take is a little bit of work on the front end. And really that's only in the beginning as you get started doing them. But they take a little bit of work on the front end to make sure you have that environment where discussions are encouraged. And this is so much easier too if you start this at the beginning of the year. From day one, I want you to make discussions a critical part of how you teach. Train your students that you are going to ask questions and wait to hear their responses. that there may be uncomfortable silences as you wait to hear them engage. Train them that if they ask questions, you're not just going to brush them off. You'll take the time to engage with them on those questions. Or if you don't have time to answer a question right then, you have a place where you write it down and you guys can come back and circle back to it as a class when you do have the time to address it. It shows them that you value the questions they have, even if you can't answer them right that second, or if it's kind of like off topic. And then that will encourage them to continue asking questions because that's the culture we want to create. Now, for those of you who have mentioned to me that you find student-centered pedagogy makes your lesson planning really difficult, this is where I just plan for things to take longer than I think so that I will always have the room or the space for discussions to happen and be student-led if they arise. So I still make my lesson plans, but I hold the pacing of them much more loosely so that I'm not completely derailed if a discussion arises, because I want to nurture and encourage those. And also, this is why they make pencils or now these fancy erasable friction pens, which I love, because it's so much easier to have a unit just entirely planned and then all you have to do is bump a lesson or bump a piece of a lesson back a day than to be scrambling each night the night before trying to figure out, okay, this is what we did today. We got a little off track, but now what are we going to do tomorrow? Go ahead and make your lesson plans, make your unit plans, but just write those plans in pencil and hold them with open hands. And then when these discussions do arrive, because you're creating that classroom environment for them, you can then kind of shift things just back a day if you need to. And if you have more questions specifically about how to engage your students in discussions, I have a blog post entirely about this that I'm going to link in the show notes. But my best advice is with getting started with it is to come up with some questions in advance that you can ask, that you can throw out there. Try to make them as open-ended as possible, but that will kind of get conversations started. And then hopefully your students will start feeling this environment and they'll start asking their own questions and you won't necessarily have to prepare some in advance. And another thing too, as your students ask really good questions, write those down. I love to put those in the notes section of my PowerPoint slides or in my unit plans so that then maybe next year, if students aren't asking great questions, you can pull from those ones that students have asked in the past and bring those up to your students to discuss as a whole. So again, check out the show notes if you want to learn more specifically about engaging your students in discussions. Okay, so again, my first tip is to start using stations in place of lecture. It's such an easy way to cut down on lecture, which is very teacher-centered teaching practice. And my second tip is to actively create an environment that encourages discussions with your students. My third suggestion of something you can do right now to make your pedagogy more student-centered is to go ahead and start the precedent that your students are in charge of any and all review that you will do for the year. If you have been around my corner of the internet for any amount of time, you will hear my vent about how much I just hate reviewing. I feel like review over the years in my classroom was so teacher-centered. It was so much pressure on me to use this last chance, this last class period, to make sure the students understood everything they did so that they would do well on the test the next day. It was just so much pressure on me to make sure I covered every single thing because I had this fear that if I didn't make sure I mentioned it again on review day, that some student was going to come back the next day, see something on the test they weren't expecting, and then the burden fell on me that I didn't prepare them. And that is what we want to avoid. And that's why we want to move towards student-centered pedagogy, because the pressure is taken off of you. That is too exhausting and it's too burdensome for the teacher. And it's just not what's best for the student, even if it's what they think is best. Instead, I shifted to putting the pressure of review onto my students because after all, review is for them. It's not for me. I don't need to review. So if they want me to set apart class time for review, they need to be active participants in it. So 2 specific ways that I love to put students in charge of review is one, for regular kind of end of test review or end of unit review before you give a test, I love to make review stations. And I am going to link, again, another blog post about this in the show notes. But this requires a little bit from the teacher on the front end prep wise, but then the actual day of review is entirely student centered. And it takes you from being up front that whole day and allows you to kind of move around the classroom and engage with students and meet them where they are. So again, I'll link in the show notes a blog for how you can make your own review stations to review for end of unit tests and do it really painlessly. And then for midterms or finals or other like large cumulative exams, thinking like EOCs or AP exams, I always do a teach the class project. So essentially students get put into groups, they're assigned a topic or a unit that we covered that year, and they become responsible for creating the review that will lead their whole class through. So I'll link in the show notes, the rubric and everything I have for that project. But I love this because again, the pressure is off of you and they learn so much through this process by being autonomous and taking ownership of it. And speaking of projects, I think one of the simplest and best ways you can revamp your pedagogy to be more student-centered is to make projects a key part of your assessment strategy. So that is my fourth and final tip. Make projects foundational in your assessment strategy for students to demonstrate their understanding. And let me be the first to say, I'm not anti-test. I love a good test. I think tests are so much easier for us as teachers if you have a well-written one to really objectively determine where our students are and to have something we can kind of grade quickly before moving on to the next thing. But one big shift I think we can make to create more space in our classrooms for our students to take ownership of their learning and express their voices and make choices is to give them projects and to make projects a regular part of your assessment strategy for your students. So here's what I want to challenge you to do. Take a look at what you are using for your assessments, especially your summative assessments. I think this will be incredibly revealing of how student-centered your pedagogy currently is. And if you're looking at your assessments, and particularly your summative ones, and you're seeing that the foundation is end-of-unit tests, I want you to consider making some changes to assess students in a way that's a bit more learner-centered so that we can kind of shift towards having more student-centered pedagogy. And again, this is because tests are really teacher-centered. It's the teacher who's coming up with every aspect of the assessment and requiring students to demonstrate their understanding in a very specific way under our terms. Whereas projects on the other end of the spectrum are incredibly student-centered. Their nature is open-ended and they create space for students to decide how to best demonstrate their understanding in a way that makes sense to them on their terms. And again, I totally get that projects can be a lot harder for us as teachers than a traditional test. And that's why if you own any of my units or curricula, you know I still include tests for every unit. But I also like to include projects as an additional alternative assessment option for my students. So in every unit I teach, I try to have one alternative summative assessment like a project for my students to show me their understanding. So yes, they'll show me in the test. So I have that really objective, really quantitative feeling assessment of them. But then I also get to see their understanding in a project too. I really feel like if we want our students to be autonomous, and we want them to be independent thinkers that are set up for success when we launch them after high school, we need to model that by entrusting them with opportunities to take ownership of their education. And that includes how we assess them on their education. I have an entire blog post about using non-traditional summative assessments in high school science classrooms. So again, I'm going to link that. I know there are so many blog posts I'm referencing because these are all topics I talk about a lot on my blog. So again, you'll be able to find all of these at itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/episode 31. Now, if this feels really overwhelming to start incorporating a project, I think a great place that you can start with this is to come up with a semester-long or a year-long independent research project for your classes. Then you're not having to come up with all these unique projects for every single unit, but you're just coming up with one for the semester or one for the year, maybe one for each semester that you teach. And it becomes a much more manageable amount for you. And it's a great way to get started with shifting your assessment strategy to include something that's student-centered like projects. And next episode, I'm going to go into this in more detail, so stay tuned. Okay, one final thought to leave you with. How do we deal with students and parents who want us to pour all of the information into their minds? I know this is something I've kind of mentioned in the first couple episodes in this series, but I really want to bring it up again because I know that this is what brings about the greatest pushback to having a more student-centered pedagogy is those students and parents who will say, "You never taught me this," or "We never learned this." They only think you taught them something if you directly lectured on it and they wrote it down in their notes. And so here's what I want to say to address that. Like I've said so many times, it helps so much to start this at the beginning of the year, but we have to train ourselves and our students and their parents in this. Because again, like with any sort of training, muscles take time to build. You can't just have a six-pack overnight. We have to train in order to achieve that. And so it's going to take some time, but slowly and surely we can see that transformation. And one of the very practical things I like to do to train parents and students to think about learning in a different way and to think about how I'm teaching them in a different way is by creating unit outlines. So initially, my first year teaching, I was in a department that was trained in the understanding by design methods of lesson planning. So essentially, I really use a lot of that when I design curriculum and when I write my lesson plans. And one thing that is aligned with UBD is always thinking about the end while you're doing the whole entire unit. So because of this, when I design a unit, I make sure I have whatever the end of unit assessment is going to be in mind. And then I create a unit outline that serves as a cover page for the packets that I give my students, but it doesn't have to be a cover page. It could just be like a one-pager you give your students. I make this unit outline and I give it to them at the very first day of the unit. And what this unit outline has on it is it has all of the objectives for the unit that I want them to be able to answer or achieve. So it could be a statement that they should be able to answer. It could be a question. It could be a skill. Like by the end of this unit, I want my students to be able to do what, or to know what, or to understand what. So you're going to list all of those things. And then it also has key vocabulary. So I go ahead and put in that outline the words that they will need to know in order to be successful on the test and understand what the questions are asking, or in order to be able to communicate in a project their understanding of waves. They need to know these certain terms related to waves in order to be able to communicate that. So again, the unit outline is hopefully just like a one-pager or front and back. That's it. It's all of the objectives for the unit and its key vocabulary. And then I make sure that every single question on my tests and every component of my end of unit projects goes back to something on this one page. And then I give them this one pager. I give them this unit outline on the first day of the unit. Then after we have our first unit test or our first end of unit assessment, we go back and I show them on this one page unit outline. Okay, question 17 comes back to you understanding this vocabulary term. Or question 2 came back to you being able to do this skill that was listed on this unit outline. And I show them too how everything on this page was covered. Hey, this objective, we did that in this lab that we spent 3 days on. Or this objective we covered in those discovery stations we did on Tuesday. Or this objective we covered in that lecture. Or this objective we covered in that discussion. I want them to start seeing that every instructional resource, every instructional method that is utilized in class is a learning experience and one that is going to come back to them at the end of the unit when they take their test or do their end of unit project. So I want them to see it's not just about lecture and it's not just about studying their notes. And that's why I love this unit outline. It is like the most important part of my lesson plan writing and my curriculum design strategy is making this unit outline for every unit and giving it to my students day one. This is another reason why I love to teach with packets. A packet is just a curriculum organization tool that I use where basically I give them every single thing they'll need paper-wise or digitally paper-wise, if we're using Google Classroom and things like that, it's everything that they'll need for the whole unit. And then this unit outline serves as the cover page for that. I love that it gives them something that's total and complete. The packet helps them to see that it's not just their notes that matter, but everything we've done in the unit, this lab or that inquiry investigation or that practice handout, all of it is useful and all of it should be studied and referenced when preparing for an assessment. I'll link a blog post in the show notes about teaching with packets and how to make your own and use them as an organizational tool if that's something you're interested in. And again, y'all know I still lecture on every topic that I teach on, even at least a little bit. I do a little bit more with my lower classmen courses than my upperclassmen. But one thing practically that helps me too is in my lecture notes when I'm making PowerPoint slides, I will put a slide that kind of breaks up the lecture that will say, hey, here's where we're going to have an active student learning experience. So for example, we go through 5 slides and then there'll be something that'll say, balloon rocket lab. And that will remind me to stop and we'll go do something like the balloon rocket lab. But then I also like it for my students too, who go back and rewatch lecture videos to study, because they'll see that slide in the recorded lecture video and be like, oh yeah, we did this thing. And I learned a lot when I made that balloon rocket. And it'll remind them of the things that we learn outside of lecture. And that's again why I love the unit outline. Everything is organized in that way, and it's a great reference for students and parents. Whew. All right, I know that was a lot. I feel like I always go into these being like, this won't be that long, and then I just get so excited and have so many things I want to tell you. But I hope that you've stuck with me and that these 4 specific strategies give you a starting place for just how you can begin to practically shift to having a more student-centered pedagogy. And let me just say, if you still feel very overwhelmed by this or don't possibly think you could have the capacity to try all of these new things this school year, hang in there with me. Next week's episode is going to tie this all together in this series, and it's going to be specifically for you. I'm going to share one thing, just one thing that you can add to your existing teacher toolbox in order to instantly make your classroom more student-centered next year. So if all of these things have been too much, tune in next week to hear this one thing that you can do. And to make sure you don't miss it, remember to follow or subscribe to Secondary Science Simplified podcast wherever you like to listen to podcasts so that you're notified when the next episode drops on Monday morning. And thank you for listening to today's episode. I know I mentioned so many links and supplemental blog posts today, so know that you can always find them in the show notes, and those can be found at itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/episode 31. And again, if you feel overwhelmed going into back to school season and you just want to do something really practical and really concrete right now to feel like you're getting some things done and getting prepared, go to itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/challenge and grab my free classroom reset challenge. All right, teacher friends, that wraps up today's episode. If you're looking for an easy way to start simplifying your life as a secondary science teacher, head to itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/challenge to grab your classroom reset challenge. And guess what? It's totally free. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you here next week. Until then, I'll be rooting for you, teacher friend.